Alright, you guys, welcome back to another video. We'll be reading Managing Oneself by Peter F. Drucker. And the next part we are going to read about is how do I learn? How do I learn? The second thing to know about how one performs is to know how one learns. Many first-class writers, Winston Churchill is but one example, do poorly in school. They tend to remember their schooling as pure torture. Yet, few of their classmates remember it the same way. They may not have enjoyed the school very much, but the worst they suffered was boredom. The explanation is that writers do not, as a rule, learn by listening and reading. They learn by writing. Because schools do not allow them to learn this way, they get poor grades. Schools everywhere are organized on the assumption that there is only one right way to learn, and that it is the same way for everybody. But to be forced to learn the way a school teacher is sheer hell for students who learn differently. Indeed, there are probably half a dozen different ways to learn. There are people, like Churchill, who learn by writing. Some people learn by taking copious notes. Beethoven, for example, left behind an enormous number of sketchbooks, yet he said he never actually looked at them when he composed. Asked why he kept them, he is reported to have replied, "If I don't write it down immediately, I forget it right away. If I put it into a sketchbook, I never forget it, and I never have to look it up again." Some people learn by doing. Others learn by hearing themselves talk. A chief executive I know who converted a small and mediocre family business into the leading company in its industry was one of those people who learn by talking. He was in the habit of calling his entire senior staff into his office once a week and then talking at them for 2 or 3 hours. He would raise policy issues and argue 3 different positions at each one. He rarely asked his associates for comments or questions. He simply needed an audience to hear himself talk. That's how he learned. And although he is a fairly extreme case, learning through talking is by no means an unusual method. Successful trial lawyers learn the same way, as do many medical diagnosticians, and so do I. Of all the important pieces of self-knowledge, understanding how you learn is the easiest to acquire. When I ask people, how do you learn? Most of them know the answer, but when I ask, do you act on this knowledge? Few answer yes. And yet, acting on this knowledge is the key to performance, or rather, not acting on this knowledge condemns one to non-performance. Am I a reader or a listener? And how do I learn are the first questions to ask. But they are by no means the only ones. To manage yourself effectively, you also have to ask, do I work well with people or am I a loner? And if you do work well with people, then you must ask, in what relationship? Some people work best as subordinates. General George Patton, the great American military hero of World War II, is a prime example. Patton was America's top troop commander. Yet when he was proposed for an independent command, General George Marshall, the U.S. Chief of Staff, and probably the most successful picker of men in U.S. history, said, "Patton is the best subordinate the American Army has ever produced, but he would be the worst commander." Some people work best as team members. Others work best alone. Some are exceptionally talented as coaches and mentors. Others are simply incompetent as mentors. Another crucial question is, do I produce results as a decision maker or as an advisor? A great many people perform best as advisors, but cannot take the burden and pressure of making the decision. A good many other people, by contrast, need an advisor to force themselves to think. Then they can make decisions and act on them with speed, self-confidence, and courage. This is a reason, by the way, that the number 2 person in an organization often fails when promoted to the number 1 position. The top spot requires a decision maker. Strong decision makers often put somebody they trust into the number 2 spot as their advisor. And in that position, the person is outstanding. But in the number 1 spot, the same person fails. He or she knows what the decision should be, but cannot accept the responsibility of actually making it. Another important question to ask include, other important questions to ask include, do I perform well under stress, or do I need a highly structured and predictable environment? Do I work best in a big organization or a small one? Few people work well in all kinds of environments. Again and again, I've seen people who were very successful in large organizations flounder miserably when they moved into smaller ones, and the reverse is equally true. The conclusion bears repeating. Do not try to change yourself. You are unlikely to succeed. But work hard to improve the way you perform. And try not to take on work you cannot perform, or you will only perform poorly. All right, you guys, so the question here in this part of the book is, how do I learn? How do you learn? Man, I can really relate to Churchill on this one because personal experience, I didn't do the best in school, and learning their way really didn't teach me anything, and it did not help me to accomplish the work or the lessons that I needed to learn in school. As a matter of fact, like the way the schooling system worked for me back in the day, and I know it's worse today, is that they funnel people into specific groups of kids that are getting it and kids that aren't getting it. When the kids, in reality, that aren't getting it, just learn the lessons, whether it's math, reading, writing, etc. They just learn a different way, but because the teacher can't teach them a specific way of how they learn, and they can only teach them how they can teach them, like the teacher only has one method of how to teach these kids, they fail to teach those students that aren't learning the curriculum, that aren't getting the lessons for their assignments and such. But the other aspect, though, too, is that between Churchill and Beethoven, I did great by doing the work, taking notes also. He learned by writing, and Beethoven learned by sketching, like drawing. To think of a composer who would actually remember what he created by drawing it and then never having to look at it again. Otherwise, he would forget it if he didn't do it in the moment, but then he'd never have to pick it up again and look at it to remember the piece of music that he composed. Like, that's amazing. But how I learned in school was taking notes. If we were able to use notes on our tests, then that helped me out a lot. And then just doing the work, like getting a visual for the curriculum or lessons that I was learning in school. So for me personally, in my experience of how I learned, it was just always by doing, seeing things, listening to myself speak it or read it out loud, and then in turn that helped me to comprehend it. All right, you guys, let's go ahead and discuss this in the comments and tell me how you learn. And I will talk to you guys soon. Thanks for watching.